It's the Real Estate Podcast, brought to you by ANZ Home Loans for financial well-beings.
We've been running this survey for kind of 5 years, ongoing. So it's been really interesting to see the change in consumer behaviour in the run-up to, say, COVID and how that changed during COVID and how it's kind of bounced back since then. And over the last couple of years, the big story has obviously been the cost of living pressure on families in Australia.
And that is Graham Cooke from Finder.com as we welcome you back into another Real Estate Breakfast podcast right around Australia. 7 days a week we are here talking property news and information from Port Douglas to Albany in WA. And you can stream us anytime, anywhere, multiple platforms, including Amazon and also Spotify. Well, the weekend went by, as it always does, way too fast. Into the Boomtown Rats, I Don't Like a Monday, April the 14th, the run-up to Easter. And PropTrack recently reported that by the end of 2026, Sydney home buyers are going to need a significant pay bump just to keep up with the cost of property. New analysis shows that a household income of $282,000 to buy a median-priced house. Even unit buyers will need a jump in earnings, with income requirements climbing to $158,000. So some pretty major money as far as that is concerned, as property prices just continue to jump up and up and up. Let's right now catch up with Graham Cooke from Finder.com. And Graham, welcome into the Real Estate Breakfast. You were telling me off here you just recently returned back from London.
Good morning, Craig. Yeah, I did. Just landed yesterday morning. Managed to land 45 minutes before the early curfew officially for the planes in Sydney. So I don't know how they managed to get clearance for that. But I've been in London for the last kind of week or so. First time I've been over there where it hasn't rained or there hasn't been a cloud in the sky for the whole week. So that was pretty remarkable.
That is very fortunate, because every time that I have been to London, it is raining. You didn't catch up with Rosie O'Donnell, did you? Oh no, she's in Dublin, I think your hometown. She's just moved out of the US.
Yeah, no, I'm originally from Dublin. You might be able to tell with the accent. Been living here 15 years. Went to London to visit family rather than Dublin, but Dublin's where I normally go to. But yeah, Rosie O'Donnell has moved to Dublin. She was interviewed on the Late Late Show, which is Ireland's prime talk show, a couple of weeks ago. So that's kind of interesting. I think she's trying to escape the madness going on in the US right now, which we might touch on further in this conversation when we talk about the housing market and tariffs and all of that. So yeah, Ireland's a bit of a safe haven for her.
Yeah, I actually saw that interview, and she's got some family, as you say. It's all about feeling safe. The way that people have made her feel, very, very friendly, of course, the Irish, and they love Rosie O'Donnell. Could there be a more Irish name?
Yeah, definitely. It's a good place to live kind of socially if you can stand the weather, which is the one thing that I couldn't stand after a bunch of years, which is why I ended up moving to Australia. So a bit of a weather migrant here.
All right. Well, as I was saying, new analysis shows a household income of $282,000 is going to be required to buy a median-priced house. I mean, that's major money, even if you look at the units, $158,000 with the income earning. I mean, it's a lot of money, and even with potential interest rate cuts this year and next year, the reality for home buyers is pretty grim.
It is, yeah. So these numbers here are based on average incomes and looking at spending the right amount of money on a mortgage that you look to be spending about a third of your income on paying back your mortgage. And if you were to do that, what would you need to earn to be able to afford to pay back a mortgage? And we're looking at what you'd need to pay in January 2025, and then using forecasting figures to predict what the price will be in 2 years at the end of December 2026. Now, the figures we used to predict price increases were from KPMG, and they're relatively modest. So the Sydney growth figure for houses, for example, was 3.3% for the first year, 7.8 over the 2 years. And that's where we got these figures. So based on these figures, in 2 years, you will need to earn 15 grand more to buy a house in Sydney, 8 grand more to buy a unit. We have those figures across all the capital cities, and they're fairly lower. So those are the figures. They're pretty big. But what's kind of important to highlight here, I think, is these are based on these original KPMG forecasts. what's happening in the global economy now with the tariffs and all the kind of economic uncertainty means, according to our panel of economists at Finder, that we might be seeing more rate cuts than expected this year. So we've seen one RBA cash rate cut already. We were initially expecting about 2 from our panel of economists. Now they're kind of saying maybe 3, maybe even 4, maybe more cash rate cuts over the course of the year. And of course, if we get cash rate cuts, that makes borrowing cheaper. And that usually means it'll push house prices up even further. So the recent economic turmoil we've seen could make these salary increases that you will be required to earn even bigger than these figures.
We talk about these global shocks. Normally with a global shock, it's heading in the opposite direction. So it just means that the prices are going up and it's more harder to get into the property market as the interest rates might kick in because the economy gets out of control. But saving a deposit still remains one of the greatest barriers to home ownership, especially in a market where house prices continue to rise. As these values go up, so does the amount needed for the upfront deposit, and then you've got stamp duty, and that means that buyers must not only earn more to qualify for loans, but also they've got to save faster, and they can't really keep up with what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you look at the house prices going up about 7% a year, if you average the last number of years out, wage increase is about half of that, about 3.5. So house prices are accelerating about twice as fast as wages are growing, which means it gets increasingly more difficult to save a deposit, increasingly higher amount of stamp duty required, and then an increasingly higher amount required to actually fund the debt on a home. So unaffordability is probably going to continue to get worse, unfortunately, in Australia because of those two factors, and also because of a factor kind of unique to the Australian market, which encourages people to invest in property, which is negative gearing, means that, you know, if you earn a lot of money, you pay a lot of tax, you're incentivized to purchase an investment property and offset your rental losses against your tax. People do that. That pushes house prices up even further. So it is a situation where if you're trying to get onto the bottom rung of the housing ladder in Australia, that bottom rung keeps getting higher and higher.
Yes, exactly right. And the Urban Development Institute of Australia is warning that we are on track for a shortfall of 400,000 homes by 2029. That is not a great figure.
Yeah, definitely supply and demand is the key factor here. And if there's not enough supply to keep up with demand, that's another factor that's going to push up the cost of housing in Australia. So it looks like, you know, the housing market in Australia has been an interesting thing to observe over the last number of years. Before COVID, when COVID kicked in, there was forecasts of the housing market being significantly impacted, maybe 10% drops in house prices from some banks. That turned out not to be the case. In fact, house prices just continued to rise. So even if we're seeing global uncertainty, even if we're seeing the lack of supplies driving that, you know, all of this is pointing towards a continuously increasing value in the housing market in Australia for everybody.
The big thing that most people are talking about, if you've got it, is the equity in your home, because in today's market, the only real way that many families are managing to upgrade is by leveraging that equity in their homes that is already baked in. And with property values steadily rising, homeowners are also able to renovate. I mean, this is a big space, the whole renovation, sell for a profit, move up the ladder, repeat, you know, buy a renovated property, sell, repeat, and over they go. It's a good way to build equity.
Yeah, and you can increase the value in your home if you do that too. We're also seeing quite a lot of Finder members looking at doing things like rent vesting in the current market. So if you live, say, in a city, but you can't afford to buy a home there, instead you purchase a home in somewhere that's more affordable and you continue to rent where you're renting, but get the income from the home separately. So that's something we're seeing kind of more of in the market now. People trying to find where in Australia they can find a little pocket of property that is within their kind of affordability range.
Now, you're a journo there, Graham, at finder.com. I guess there's so many stories around, and has been over the last few years. You're never short of probably tracking down a story to report on.
Yeah, so at Finder, we have an ongoing piece of research called the Consumer Sentiment Tracker. So we survey consumers in Australia. We ask them a bunch of questions about their kind of finances, their personal lives, their intentions to travel and holiday, and their job security, all that type of thing. We've been running this survey for kind of 5 years ongoing. So it's been really interesting to see the change in consumer behavior in the run up to, say, COVID, and how that changed during COVID and how it's kind of bounced back since then. And over the last couple of years, the big story has obviously been the cost of living pressure on families in Australia. We have a metric in Finder called called the Cost of Living Pressure Gauge, which estimates the pressure on families because of the cost of living using our consumer data I just mentioned there, but also government data. And that is designed to look a bit like if you've driven around Australia, you know, those fire severity gauges, they go all the way from low fire risk to kind of extreme catastrophic fire risk, I think in some states. It's designed like that. And the cost of living pressure on households in Australia has been in the extreme range on our chart for the last couple of years. And that's all we've been talking about in media basically for 2 years straight. Cost of living, cost of living. What's interesting recently is around the time of the first cash rate cut we saw recently, that pressure's actually started to ease a little bit. The cost of living pressure has fallen below the extreme range for the first time in 2 years. So positive news for consumers is, even though everyone's talking about cost of living all the time, it does look like we might potentially be at the turning point or the beginning of the end of the cost of living crisis. Having said that, all the crazy stuff that's happening globally with markets and with potential recessions and with tariffs means that right now the future is very uncertain. And if that trend is going to continue is kind of what remains to be seen.
Right now, the future is very, very uncertain with Trump there doing all sorts of things when it comes to the trade tariff. He was handed one of the best economies in the US ever, only to drive it potentially into a recession, which is going to keep journos like you and everybody very busy talking about some of the ramifications. Hey, Graham, I feel as if we could continue this conversation for another hour, but we'll have to leave it there. Enjoy your Monday. Enjoy the close down of this week into Easter for this coming weekend. And thanks for coming on to the Real Estate Breakfast.
Thank you, Craig. Looking forward to talking to you again.
We don't just report on real estate news, we take you to the source of the information. We produce more property podcasts every week than anyone else. We are your trusted guide for all things real estate.
Yeah, it also sort of plays in the lane of what we were talking about towards the end of last year, and that is the millennials wanting a lifestyle that is comparable to their parents. And we talked about it, you know, the millennials and probably the Gen Zs, they want to match the same type of house going into the property market as their parents, which, you know, a lot of people say it's unrealistic, but we've had commentators on the podcast say, well, it's not their fault. It is the way that they have been raised by their parents that make them think that way.
It's funny that you say that because my children are quite young. They're all in primary school and high school. But the conversations we have with them already about their future reflect some of this, where I say to them, when we're talking about money, I say, Dad and I have money, but you don't. So when you get older, you're going to need to be paying for your own things. So you need to start to think about how you're spending and saving and what you want your future to be. I have a 14-year-old who she talks about having a car in a few years. And I say, well, you need to start thinking about that now, and you need to start putting aside money from your part-time job now to be able to afford that when you're 17. And I can understand both sides of that sentiment. Children grow up with a certain quality of life and living a certain lifestyle, and they then get to the age of buying their own home. If you're in a capital city, say you're in Sydney or Melbourne, and you're used to a certain lifestyle, you don't necessarily want to move and live in the outer suburbs when you're a younger person, where it might be more affordable. So their expectations are a little bit different. But there's also a reality that the way the property market works these days is very different. When I bought my first property, which was just over 20 years ago, I couldn't afford back then to buy where I wanted to live. I had to buy in a regional area to be able to afford to get in the market. And I did the traditional thing that a lot of people did back then, which was to buy something very small and affordable. It was by no means my dream home. It had exposed brick walls inside, and it was very cheap and cheerful. There was a bit of growth in the market, which allowed me a few years later to sell that and buy a bigger townhouse. I went from a unit to a townhouse. And then 5 years after that, I was able to sell the townhouse and buy a freestanding home. That was quite a natural progression in what people did 20, 30 years ago. You'd buy a very small starter home and work your way up. Whereas these days, even the very small starter homes, particularly in capital cities, are quite expensive. So I think both sides of those arguments are actually really valid. It is really expensive to get started these days. The difference between the income to housing price ratio has increased a lot. It used to be around 1 to 3. It's now 1 to 6, 1 to 7. In Sydney, I believe it's 1 to 8. So there is a really big difference between what the experience is like of buying your first home now to what it was 20, 30, 40 years ago.
We connect you to the best real estate information across Australia. The Real Estate Podcast.